machine is on the march again.
Leicester Fan TV presents a variety of content like fan discussions, match analysis, and engaging with Leicester fans worldwide. We want your views live, thanks to our sponsors, Everard's, Pucker Pies, Hologram, Take Me, Newbie & Co, and the Fox's Arms.
Want to watch more content like this? Hit the like button. Give us your views. Hit subscribe to Leicester Fan TV and make sure to follow Leicester Fan TV on all socials.
All right, everyone, how's it going? No, it's not Sunday morning. No, it's not the Foxes Aftermath show. The new thing about town is PSR, and we have got, which is way above my pay grade, so we have got the man that knows everything, Mr. Dan Plumley. Sorry, not Mr. Dan Plumley, Dr. Dan Plumley, from his head of sports finance from Sheffield Hallam University, and he's come to tell us all about it. Morning, Dan. How are you?
Morning, Jamie. Yeah, no pressure on that one. I'll do my best.
Like I said, it's way above my pay grade.
No, delighted to be on.
We're not going to start at the beginning. We're going to start at, I think, nearly the end of it. I mean, New Year's Eve, it all came out that Leicester were on the verge of breaking the PSR rules again, and we had a long 2 weeks wait for it. But somehow it came out a couple of weeks ago that we'd actually adhered to the rules. Were you quite surprised at that? Because there was a big thing about it saying, yeah, Leicester are going to get points deduction and a big fine and that. But then it came out, like I said, no points deduction for anybody. Were you quite surprised about that?
Yeah, to be honest, a little bit yes and no. And I've done a bit of work because a lot of the research I'm involved in kind of sits within this space. So there was a scenario where, based on kind of the numbers we can see from the outside looking in, and you can never see the full picture for the record, but in terms of best guess estimates, there was a bit of a scenario where it could play out that no club got charged. And we know Leicester were one of those ones kind of that people were talking about on the fringes. There were others as well, of course, and we saw the move around of academy players between Newcastle, Chelsea, Everton and Villa last summer, and all that's PSR related. So I guess they were one of the ones that were on the radar, but there was a scenario where it played out like this. And I think one other thing to mention there is the bigger picture, as you said. We're also pretty sure that the Premier League at some point will move away from the current version of PSR. UEFA have already moved to a new version of financial sustainability regulations, which are for clubs competing in their three competitions. And it's likely that the Premier League move. So I think there's that in the backdrop as well, that meant actually maybe we shouldn't be as surprised by no charges than perhaps we were when that story broke, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, because it's done over a year, but we're like 6 months behind, aren't we, with when it comes out, which is a bit of a problem because people seem to forget that we had the Harvey Barnes money in there, we had the Timothy Castagna in there, we had Enzo's leaving, and we had, I think, Dewsbury Hall's just managed to sneak in there in time. So to me, it wasn't really a big surprise because I thought we'd actually covered all the bases with that money coming in. But I know there's other factors included, not just player sales and wages included in the PSR, isn't that? Yeah,
absolutely right. And that's the problem from the outside looking in. You are behind the curve a little bit, as you say, because the league and the club are looking at that in real time. So the Maresca situation, those players that you mentioned, are not included in the accounts that we can see because they're already a year behind the curve. So yeah, that's absolutely a relevant factor. The other thing you mentioned as well that we don't often see, some clubs will publish this in their accounts, some don't, but the league will see this information, is all the things that you can put in that are exempt from PSR, things around infrastructure spend, academy investment in the women's setup. There are certain things you can write off and claw back. And some, as I say, some clubs publish that in their accounts, but we won't see that until they make the public domain. But others don't. But those are calculations that will go into the mix as well. So yeah, from the outside looking in, you're always a little bit behind the curve time-wise. And you're also kind of, as I said, working on as close as you can get to best guess estimates based on what you know about the club and its current situation.
I mean, you mentioned there about the rules, and it's the looking into changing the rules of how it's worked. I mean, what actually is the situation now? It's something like 105 million over 3 years, isn't it?
Yes, it is. 105 million cumulative loss over 3 years, but there is a difference within that. Around there's only 15 million of that, so 5 million a year is kind of direct equity input. The rest is structured quite differently. But yeah, essentially you arrive at this figure of 105 million over 3 years. There's a nuance in that, particularly for Leicester, as you and your channel will be fully aware, around it changes if you've been in the Championship, because the Championship have a 3-year rolling cumulative figure, but it's not 105, it's 39. So you have to adjust for years that you're in the Championship and the Premier League if that 3-year period straddles across, which of course it did for Leicester, and we've seen the other case with the Premier League on that as well, which is still rumbling in the background, of course, an important point to mention. And yeah, if you look at kind of forward thinking, what UEFA have done is moved away from, there's still a break-even principle and there are acceptable losses, but what the UEFA are focusing on now more than ever, which is what we think the Premier League will mirror, and the Football League actually in time, if we're looking at even further down the track, is this squad cost ratio. And this takes into account all kind of player expenses, wages, the amortization fee, which is the transfer fee divided by the length of the contract, agents' fees, manager fees. It's a kind of catch-all player cost. And what UEFA are wanting that figure to be by 25-26 is 70% of revenue. And they've transitioned that from 90%, 80% over the last couple of years. So I think what's probably going to happen in the Premier League is we'll see that kind of in the mix as well moving forward. And people have talked about this kind of what the percentage will be set at for Premier League clubs. But there will have to be a transition element to that as well. So I guess to go back to the wider point on PSR that we started with, if you are just stopping one set of regulations and moving on to a new one, even if there's some similarity, you've still got to allow for transition. So I think what we might see is maybe a 2-3 year period of transition if we do move completely away from the old regs onto new ones. So that's good and bad, I guess, for the clubs. It'll mean a little bit of restructuring. It'll mean a lot of work, but also it gives them a bit of flex in the short term to move away from one set of regulations and onto new ones. So I think that's kind of things that might be coming down the track. But at the minute, 105 is still the number that we're looking at over 3 years.
Well, I've heard a lot of things that some have gone straight over the top of my head. One is how that 105 figure is still about with the cost of living and the interest rates. Surely now that should be gone up to 105 a year, not because of the cost of living and everything. We can't live on the same money I was living on when 10 years ago when this PSR came in, I think it was.
Yeah.
You'd be struggling. I don't know how it works.
It's a great point, and it's something I've said time and time again. The regulations have not shifted with time, basically. So they were started in 2011. It came out of UEFA, and then obviously the Premier League adopted their own set, and other leagues around Europe did the same. But yeah, even if you look at inflation as a factor, as a really simplistic measure, if we look at that 105 million in 2011, that's 150 million now in 2024 inflation prices. So even something as easy as implying an inflation calculator, you get to a figure of, well, it should be 150, even if we take that. The way the industry's gone, which is what a lot of the owners have said, and other clubs, again, not just Leicester, but clubs like Villa and Newcastle, have been very critical of PSR. Even if you look at that, there's scope, to suggest, how do some of those clubs compete with the biggest clubs? Because they're already well set, they already earn more, they did at the time. And I've, again, done loads of work in this space around this kind of phrase of the unintended consequence of regulation. And we've certainly seen that in the industry. It has helped financial sustainability, don't get me wrong. And that's important, but it was always likely to cause some of these unintended consequences. And I think, you're absolutely right. What are we, 12 years down the track now? We're starting to see that. And I think, again, going back to the Premier League themselves, they're aware of this, which is why we'll probably see a change in the regulation sooner rather than later. Good,
because I think it's very unbalanced. This is my from a football fan, not from a financial man like yourself. This is a football fan. I think it's very very biased to the bigger clubs than it is the smaller clubs. because you look at Chelsea, you look at Man City, then I mean, Man City have been going on these, breaking these. I think it was 115 rules. I think it was law breaches, whatever you want to call it. And they're still, nothing's ever happened to them. But you look at Forest. I know that's a bad word on this channel saying Notts Forest, but you look at Forest and Everton. They got done within months. But Man City are still under this court case, and it's still not happened. Nothing's happened. So will these new rules actually make it a bit more even for the smaller clubs and the bigger clubs, or will it still be like a top six bias towards the bottom?
I mean, I still think, unfortunately, the way the industry is, even if we move to a new set of regs, that if you look at UEFA's as the benchmark, and we focus on that squad cost ratio, if it's 70% of revenue, it still stands to reason that the clubs that earn more can spend more. So they're still likely to be ahead, and that's the challenge with it. Is any piece of regulation is always going to be anti-competitive to somebody, especially in a world like football, whereby actually the only way you close the gap is to invest. And there's wider conversations in that the gap between leagues is too big, which is a bigger issue for the game. And that kind of goes back to the start of the Premier League. Like it's much bigger than that. But there are those points that are in there. And I think the other thing with the regulation there, just to use those cases that you've mentioned, is the City case is very different, of course, because that's charges over a number of years. And the thing there is that the Everton and Forest case were a little bit more straightforward, albeit still quite complex, in a sense that they were looking at one breach in a particular time frame, but it still took an awful amount of time to get that verdict, and there's a lot of litigation behind the scenes. I guess the other thing with PSR that came out from the Everton and Forest case as well, and this is where perhaps a criticism of the regulations again and not being as clear as they could have been from the start, is we were trying to then think about, the conversation was, well, what is the acceptable charge going to be for Everton and Forest? But what we could have had in the regulations from the start was a clear message that if you breach by X amount of million, it carries X points deduction. And hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I think, again, those things probably should have been in the regs from the start, to say, right, these are the clear punishments, and if clubs are going to then run the risk or even knowingly break those rules, then they knew what the punishment was going to be, and I don't think clubs ever knew that, and that kind of came out in the Everton and Forest case as well. So that's got to change moving forward, certainly for me.
Yeah, there was one other thing on 2 weeks, not 2 weeks ago, last week, Top wrote off a debt of 124 million. 2 years ago, he wrote off a debt of 194 million. And he turned them, well, he didn't write it off, he made them into shares, didn't he? But to us, normal fans, it's like, oh yeah, the debt's gone. How does that affect anything at all within the PSR rulings? Do we get tables, or how? I don't know how it.
Yeah, it does. It does affect that, and it's also the kind of not the first example you mentioned there, but the most recent one also has some links to another linked area of football finance around associated party transactions, which is what one of the City and Premier League cases were, a separate case around that. And what that was basically saying was around the owners and how they input money into the football club, and the change there was to say, well, actually, you now can't put that money in as a loan, because a lot of those loans went in interest free, so it's kind of between the club and the owner. But what City have argued and have won a small victory there in that regard is that those should be treated as the same way in which they're looking at the owners of Manchester City as an example. So those loans will now have to be restructured, so they'll carry some sort of interest rate. Now, what the clubs have done with that, a lot of them, and Leicester would be an example of this, is the owners have then converted those loans into equity, which actually comes at a personal cost to the owner, because it means that you can't recall that loan back. It's in as equity, which now benefits the club. So it's, I guess, from a financial point of view, it's a really good gesture by the owner. The hand's been forced a little bit, but they still have a choice to make. So it benefits the club principally more so than the owner. And I guess one thing I would say with Leicester as well is, if you look at all these financial things that we're talking about, one thing that they have had as a constant throughout is a really strong ownership group that seems to be, certainly again from the outside looking in, really committed to the club, really connected to the club and is willing to fund some of these things and lose their own money effectively in time to support the football club. And that's really important as a positive for Leicester, because not every club is in that position. So yeah, there are still challenges, and that's the way it's worked from a loan to equity point of view, linked to what's going on in the wider space. But I think the overarching positive, as I said there, for Leicester is the ownership group has remained committed, and that's really important.
Yeah, I think Top's taken a bit of stick over the football side of it just recently this month, the chairman and the board. But I think on the financial side of it, there's still a little bit of umming and ahhing because we're not getting money for the transfer window. But that's totally different. That's a football.
Well, and I think as well, Jamie, you're absolutely right. And what that shows as well is some of the things we spoke about earlier around actually how tough the industry is at the minute. And you've got a club that, you know, has had kind of success beyond what they ever thought was possible, and didn't expect to get relegated. But it does show, if you have that one bad season, it becomes really difficult then to catch back up, because even if you come straight back up as you have done, that kind of year out is a longer time than you think, because now you're struggling again to stay there, and you've got to get that position of safety back to then be able to grow. And even for a club like Leicester, who've had that success, if you drop into the Championship even for a season, it's hard to get back, and then it's hard to stay there again. And that's where, as you say, it will come down to sporting performance as well.
Yeah, just one last. I mean, it's been great listening to you, because I've known nothing. I've heard little bits from other people and that, and I've not really taken it all in. But I've been able to speak to someone face to face. It's been great listening. One last thing I want to ask about is we've still got this constant battle with the Premier League, and it seems like one's trying to get one over, one's trying to evade something, one's trying to lose out on anything. Do you think this stems from last year when we found a little bit of a loophole over, I think the wording was jurisdiction, I think they're calling it, from the EFL and the Premier League? So do you think the Premier League are trying to get one over on us, or are Leicester City standing firm and saying, well, this is where we stand, you try and beat us?
I think, as always, it's a little bit of both, isn't it? You know, when both sides enter into a dispute and you have that kind of, you know, everyone wants to stand their ground and you're trying to prove, you know, which one's right or wrong. But you're absolutely right. It goes back to that particular instance, and that goes back to the regulation as well. So the fact that Leicester were in the Championship and then in the Premier League, and what they did was extend their accounting year-end date by 1 month, which basically allowed them to say, well, in that time we're not under Premier League jurisdiction, so you can't charge us. Now, that's completely fine and legal from an accounting point of view. Companies can change their year-end dates whenever they want. But what it did was put the spotlight on the why it was happening for the club, to be able to then say, well, this is a grey area because you can't charge us. And that's how it's played out. So that's exactly what it was. It was a loophole in PSR. It was nothing to do with any accounting problems. But yeah, kind of how it's rumbled on and what you're seeing now. And it's not gone away, of course, has it? It's still there. So there's no PSR charge, which is great, that we spoke about. But this has still got to come to some sort of conclusion. But it's exactly that. It's now the standoff between, okay, two sides going back and forth. And as we've alluded to, you know, we talk about finance as much nowadays, financing football as much as we do on the pitch, but we're also talking about legal cases as well nowadays. So the world of finance and law is colliding, and yeah, they're always interesting cases, but yeah, it's a tricky one to square off.
I bet you wish someone asked you to come on a show about football instead of money all the time, don't you, Dan?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I love the sport, and as I say, you know, I'm a fan as well, and it's great to do this for a living as well. But yeah, it's always kind of weird looking back how it plays out, doesn't it? Because this is now a kind of job in this space, and there's lots of people interested in it, and there's loads of roles in finance and law in football, and you know, it's just exploded, hasn't it, from a business side of things. But yeah, sometimes it's just nice to talk about what happened on a Saturday afternoon or a Tuesday evening. But yeah, maybe
totally off kilter. Do you actually get time to chill out and go and watch any football at all? Because who's your club? You sound a bit
I do. Yeah, I have to be. You're always careful, aren't you? But let's put cards on the table. I'm a Sheffield Wednesday fan. Yeah, so I'm. That's been my club from day one. and I blame my dad for that, but that's how it goes, isn't it? And I don't get as much as I used to because we've got young family at the minute and lots of things going on. But yeah, still try and get a few times a season. And it's as we say, it's in the blood, isn't it? And you can't do anything about that. So no, I'm definitely a fan of the game as well, as much as I have to analyse the off-pitch stuff for work-related things.
Yeah, it's like the same here with me. Me living here 20 years in Spain, I always tell people you can take the boy out of Leicester, but you can't take Leicester out of the boy, I'm afraid. So I'm very much the same as you, Dan.
Absolutely.
I tell you what, Dad, it's been much appreciated. Like I said to you earlier, trying to actually comprehend what everything means. In fact, it's been nice to sit down and actually speak to someone and try and get in this thick skull of mine, this 54-year-old thick skull, something in there. And I think you've actually got it in there for once, actually being able to listen to someone.
No, thanks for having me on, and I'm glad, because it is tricky to try and unpick it sometimes. So yeah, try and keep it as simple and as easy to consume as possible. But no, much appreciated. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Cheers, Dan. Thanks a lot. Just we'll leave you there. Just stay in the background a second, Dan. There you go, lads and lasses. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I shall see you on Sunday. I hope we brought you something a bit different of all things PSR. Cheers all. See you later.
The Leicester City machine is on the march again.
Leicester Fan TV presents a variety of content like fan discussions, match analysis, and engaging with Leicester fans worldwide. We want your views live, thanks to our sponsors, Everard's, Pucker Pies, Hologram, Take Me, Newbie & Co, and the Fox's Arms.
Want to watch more content like this? Hit the like button. Give us your views. Hit subscribe to Leicester Fan TV and make sure to follow Leicester Fan TV on all socials.